Hey everybody, this is Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. And this week we have an international guest. I'm not going to explain where she is and where she comes from because that'll be a very entertaining part of the podcast, so I will just simply read her very short and yet eloquent bio. Alina Bartuli is just another Korean Ukrainian American podcasting from El Salvador. So I cannot wait to pick your awesome brain, Alina, and welcome to the show. How are you?
Hey, Mike. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. And as has happened more recently and in a very good way, you're someone who I actually went on your podcast and we met, and I just find it's the best way to get guests for my podcast is to go on someone else's and kind of get to know you through that avenue. So thank you again for coming on.
Yeah, because there are not many people who are willing to talk about death, right, Mike?
No, definitely not. And actually, before we get going, why don't you tell us the name of your podcast just so people can look it up? Because I don't know when your release date and mine's going to be.
Sure. It's Mindshift with Alina Bartuli. We talk about balanced and fulfilling lifestyle in our crazy, over-changing world, just how to maintain your peace in international context as well.
Awesome. And it's a very timely time to talk about peace and the world because it is November 19th, 2024 as we record. And I just feel as time goes on and time marches on, there's like a different way people talk about the world because I guess globalization really not only has happened and is happening, but the internet and technology has really made it evident that we are a global world culture. So real quick, before we get back into that subject, the reason I didn't ask you the very first question I normally ask guests, which is how old are you, where did you grow up, and what generation are you from, if any, is because your life is so beautifully complicated, and that's like a huge reason I wanted to have you on the podcast is I love the intersection of culture, ethnicity, race, if people want to use that term, and other like things and just politics. So let's start with the most basic part of that, which is how old are you and where were you born?
I am 35 years old. I'm a millennial, and I was born in Ukraine and raised.
And then right now you live in El Salvador, is that correct?
That's correct. El Salvador, yes. El Salvador, the most dangerous country in the world that is now the safest, according to some people.
Wow, that's really interesting. Actually, I'd love to just kind of talk about that. I'll tell you why I find that so interesting is when I was a little kid, I was scarred in that weird way that only teachers can scar children, which is there was a new kid at our school, and he was living with another kid in our school, and they said, "Why are you living with him?" And he said, I'm from El Salvador, but my country is very dangerous, so my parents sent me here. And then, like, the way kids and rumors work, it somehow became this thing where, like, someone came in his village and killed everyone, and he fled and made it here. I don't think that part is true. But at the same time, historically speaking, this was, like, 1985, 1986, and there was, like, absolutely some really scary stuff going on in El Salvador. So I'm just curious, how did you even pick it, and do you feel safe there?
Yes. So I have lived here for 5 years now. So I have lived here before what's called in Spanish régimen de excepción, which is a exceptional state or a state of exception, where the gang members were basically cleaned out from the street and put into jails, and the huge world largest jail was built. Wow. So before and after, I know both of the worlds, and I've seen gang members in my daily life. Sometimes you can't even recognize them. But the thing is, I've always felt safe here, no matter what. Because no matter what the news and the mainstream media tells you, the actual experience of living here as an international person, as an expat, as a foreigner, is very, very different from what local communities have to deal with. The ones that live in used to live in gang-inflicted neighborhoods, you know. So I would say that, it's very safe now, including for local communities, which is great. I'm just super happy for everybody.
That's awesome. Mm-hmm. And what I know, like you said, and this is always going to be true with every question I ask you about El Salvador, since you are an outsider, but you have been there for 5 years, which is a long time, have you had a chance to speak with locals, and have any of them actually expressed dissent about the policy to build that prison and put gang members in. And I'm asking from more of like the American perspective of like, well, how do you know they're in a gang? What's due process? Like that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. So I have worked here for the U.S. government project, and I worked with local staff, locally employed staff, what's called the lingo, government lingo for that. So yes, I was friends and co-workers, colleagues with local Salvadoran people, and I also knew people from like really bad gang-inflicted neighborhoods, and I spoke to them as well. So the big controversy from El Salvador, from the international community perspective, including U.S. government, is the human rights violation that everybody talked about when innocent people were put to jail, right? Because they were associated or presumed to be associated with gang members. And yes, it's true. There is a percentage of innocent people that sits in jail right now as we speak. But the problem is I was also, like I said, I was friends with some people from those neighborhoods. And they told me that it's really difficult to distinguish between people who are gang members and not. Yes, some are obvious gang members, like there are specific marks, tattoos, things that, yes, for sure, this is a gang member. But for instance, my domestic help employee, this is the world where we can hire domestic help. Yeah, it's affordable here.
Cool.
So she told me she lived in a gay neighborhood, right? So she told me that when once in a while she sleeps in her house and she hears how gang members escape from the police and they use rooftops of her house to escape. And sometimes they come inside of her house, right? Or her neighbor's house, or she lives close to her son. So they use her son's house as a place to hide from police. And they held him on a knife or a gunpoint. So in a way, he had to cooperate with them. So those people are innocent, but it's hard to distinguish who cooperated like willingly, right? And who did out at a gunpoint, right?
Wow.
So I think the general understanding of how people reacted, they're super happy that it's safe. They're super happy. And they know that it came at cost of some innocent people who are in jail right now. But overall, I see this country is flourishing. People walk on the street, and not only in nice neighborhoods, but also in bad, historically bad neighborhoods, right? They walk freely on the streets. They smile. They feel free to even go and vote. In this country, even voting was dangerous, for some people earlier on. So yes, I can see that the country is flourishing right now, and people are happy overall.
That's awesome. That was a great answer. Thank you. That was incredible. I'm so excited to ask you more questions like this because I love the way you balance and weigh all of this, which obviously is why your podcast is incredibly successful and good, because it was like obvious within 1.5 minutes of meeting you that you like to hear from people and let people talk. And, and I think that's cool. So I not only trust what you said, but it also just like passes my test of like, I've lived in very dangerous cities before and after policies. And I know that the average person just wants to be able to walk down the street, not be afraid, and get their groceries and go home. That's cool to hear. All right. So let's go way back in time. Now we're going to talk about Ukraine, which is where you're from and raised. Now Ukraine now, as we record this podcast, 2024 is probably not considered a safe place either. But I'm actually more curious. If you're 35 and I'm 43, that means you were born in 1989, 1990?
1989, correct.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to start with just like a lot of Americans think they know a lot about Ukraine right now because of the news and stuff. I am not one of them. I'm just going to be very honest. While I am Latvian and Estonian in half of my DNA, and while I have family from like sort of that region, I was raised like memorizing a Cold War map. So to me, it was just the USSR, and like the fall of the Berlin Wall happened when I was actually old enough to like understand it. So Ukraine has always just been like a place that became a country in my life, but I know that the people there have always felt like it was a country. And so, the older I get and the more I study, the more I can understand that. But like I said, I'm not actually informed the way some people might pretend they are or actually be. And so I'm really curious to learn about it from you. Growing up in Ukraine, you were born right after the Berlin Wall came down. So were you technically born in a country called Ukraine, or was it still a satellite republic?
This is an interesting question. I was born in the Soviet Union, a country that doesn't exist anymore. Yes.
Wow.
And it's interesting that we're speaking to each other right now, right? Because during the Cold War, like you said, we would be on the other sides of that war. But, I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen, and it was a conscious choice. When I was an adult, I became a U.S. citizen. So now we're actually at the same side.
That's awesome. I love it.
No worries. Not to worry here, Mike. So it's funny because I actually have a birth certificate from the Soviet Union,
Wow.
the country that doesn't exist anymore, right?
Oh, that's so cool.
And it has some kind of complications when I have like bureaucratic matters to attend to, right? Like if anybody would have to ask me for a copy or a translation of it, or one time actually U.S. Embassy when I was applying for back then when I was applying first for a tourist visa and then for a migrant like a spouse visa, migrant visa. They asked me for original of my birth certificate, and I presented them my Soviet Union certificate, and they were like, "Whoa, we're gonna be really careful not to lose it because there's no way you can replenish that one." I'm like, yes, please, be careful.
Wow. So when you were growing up, like, how did you identity formation is kind of the overall subject I'm trying to ask about, like. When you were like, let's say 10 years old in 1999, did you tell people like, I am Ukrainian, I live in Ukraine? Like, is there a lot of like Ukraine pride, or is Ukraine just like I'm just trying to feel out, and again, this isn't leading to some question about the current war at all. It's more I'm trying to figure out like the identity that happens in these situations. Like, is your family historically Ukrainian, and so like therefore, yeah, I'm sure you understand what I'm trying to ask.
Oh, thank you very much for this identity question, because I have been struggling with identity question my whole life because it's just so complicated, right? My family are ethnic Koreans, so there were Korean migrants in the Soviet, actually even before, I think, during the Soviet. So I'm like fourth generation Korean immigrant into like post-Soviet countries, right?
Wow.
And even though I was, the Soviet Union collapsed 2 years after I was born. Yeah. And so I think what happened is I personally always had an identity as a Ukrainian when I was growing up in Ukraine. But my mother, who went to a school in the Soviet Union, and she also was born in Ukraine, in Kharkiv, being an ethnic Korean. And she had a different type of identity, I think, and a different type of school system that taught different things. For instance, in my school, they taught a lot Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian language, along with Russian language, which is my native language.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah, I'm from Kharkiv. I had no, probably everybody by now they heard my name, the name of my birth city in the news, and I never imagined in my life that this will ever happen, this day will ever come, and that this news will be so horrifying, right?
Yeah.
Basically, Kharkiv is a Russian-speaking city, close to the border with Russia. It's 1 hour by car, literally, to get to the closest Russian city, Belgrade, I think. Yeah. So I was a Russian-speaking Ukrainian growing up, right? And my mom was probably a person who was struggling with transitioning into living in a new country that she didn't even know like what is going to happen with how this country is going to turn out, right? Because all she knew was Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So in the Ukrainian schools where I studied, we received a different type of education. That Ukrainian pride, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language is good, and Ukrainian history classes, no matter what century we're talking about. I was a kind of person who liked to. I don't know, smarty pants I like to be effective and productive. So anyway, no matter what century of Ukrainian history we talked about or we learned or studied, there's always a magic conclusion that you wrote in your exam that was Ukrainian people courageously fought for their independence from Russian during the centuries.
Yeah.
So like, this is the type of education and the type of Ukrainian pride I received through the new schooling system in the new independent Ukraine, which was completely different from the education my mom got.
Wow. That's so interesting. So
Mm-hmm.
let's kind of flash forward now. What age were you when you left Ukraine?
I was 21 years old when I left Ukraine. I left for South Korea because I have Korean roots. Well, I could have gone to North Korea, but no, not really.
I was totally going to ask that.
Country.
Yeah.
Nah. No, you know what? When my ancestors migrated or moved from Korean Peninsula, it was just one country. They moved that early, due to Japanese occupation.
Do you know which part, though, like they were actually from? Like, was it in technically what's now North?
Yes, I was trying to do some research, and I've been asking my grandpa if he knows anything. And he told me, it's really difficult because he never shared this story with me growing up. So I had to kind of like interrogate him. And I was like, hey, what side? I need to know just for my identity purposes. But anyway, back then it was one country, right? So there were no North or South Korea. But they did come from the northern part of Korea, as far as I know.
Cool. Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Because it's just geographically closer to Russian border.
Yeah.
So they just crossed the border, to Russia.
That's so it's actually funny too, because technically a long time ago, like especially your parents at least, they could have easily visited North Korea during a period in which that was absolutely impossible for most of the world. Like,
yeah, it blows my mind. Sometimes I think about it, like what would have happened if they stayed, or if they crossed border to China instead of Russia, or, just so many things could go differently in my life story, but it went the way it went.
Yeah. And so speaking of which, how was South Korea, and how long did you stay, and did you meet family? Did you establish like great connections and things?
Yes. So basically I went to South Korea, even though I didn't have any connections there, no relatives, and nobody in my family speaks any Korean, by the way. My grandpa spoke a little bit of Korean, and he even worked as a translator, but it was like the Korean he learned at a Korean school in Russia back in the, so it's just very different type of Korean. The South Korean was different from the Korean he spoke. So I basically made my connections from scratch, and I started learning language from scratch because I wanted to become part of my culture, of my ancestors' culture, just to kind of learn who I am too. I was searching for my place in life.
So how many years were you there total?
I had lived there for 6 years in total.
And you learned fluent Korean easily and all that?
Oh, I wouldn't say easily because I had to study 2 languages at the same time. When I moved, my English was like not good. Not good. I could understand what people talk about, like I could get the gist of it, but I couldn't speak, fluently. So what happened is I was like an international student from Ukraine in Korea, living in a dormitory with other international and Korean students, and everybody around me, because I was part of the international students community, were speaking English. They were from all kind of countries, all over the world. Yeah. And what was fascinating for me, I actually met a lot of ethnic Koreans from France, African countries, from all over the world. As I remember I was in the elevator one of these days, one of my first days in Korea, and I saw a Korean girl who was speaking perfect French, right? Because she was from France. She was French. And I was so fascinated. I was looking at her like, wow, this is so amazing. And then I remembered that I was a Korean girl who speaks like Russian. Okay, yeah. I guess. Yeah. So it was a fascinating experience to be a student there.
That's so great. That's really cool. And lived in Ukraine until you were about 21, went to South Korea for 6 years, so then you're 27. So what was your next stop after South Korea?
So in South Korea, I did study language, studied master's degree, and I worked in LG R&D there. And after that, learning language was not easy, FYI, because in a way I committed to learning Korean and English at the same time. Because I needed Korean, because my master's degree was in Korean, and I needed English for daily life conversations, for just to be part of this society. So I kind of decided that I'm going to learn a Korean and English at the same time. So that's what I did. And after that, I basically immigrated to the United States.
Okay. And that's when you became naturalized, this period of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah, it's not that easy, FYI.
I don't think it is.
The truth is that there are not many legal ways to immigrate to the United States. It's true. The easiest way is to get married, to a U.S. citizen, which happened to me. Not that I was intending to do it on purpose, but I just happened to meet a guy in the U.S. From the U.S. in Korea. Yeah.
Oh, and actually, I should have asked. Wait, hold on. That was awesome. I have to step. I think you said something very different from what I thought you were going to say. You met an American while in South Korea, and then the two of you came back to America and then got married. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, that's awesome. That's a really cool. That's I know how the story ends, sort of, so I will not belabor talking about it right now. But I am curious. Which state did you come to when you first came to America?
When I first came to the U.S., I was in Virginia, Arlington, Virginia.
Oh, Arlington. Okay.
Because that's where the government jobs are, right?
Yep.
And so that happened. We were part of the U.S. Diplomatic community for like 6 or 7 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a scary community.
Virginia.
I'm very familiar with it. A lot of my college friends are from there and participate in it. So, and when I say scary, I just mean that it's like intense and there's a lot of people and there's a lot of opinions and it's just a very like, for me, for my personality, it's like exciting and dangerous and just like interesting to me. So, Okay, well, great. I think I wanted to spend this much time on your identity and your moving and all that because I think it creates such a good painting of like who you are and where you're coming from when we get into what the podcast is really about, which is metaphysics, which is our opinions of the afterlife or the before life or just if there even is life. So I am curious, let's just start with the most basic question that we ask, which is, what do you think happens when you die? And then I'll ask, I'm sure, a ton of follow-up questions.
Hey everyone, if you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks.
So the thing is, nobody on this earth knows what's going to happen after we die, and I am not an exception. Some people follow religion, right? So they base, but knowledge is not faith, and faith is not knowledge. That's why they're called different things. But your question was, what do you think?
Yes.
So it's more of a rational thing, right? And if I think rationally, I don't know. That's my answer. I literally do not know what is going to happen to me after I die. So let's just assume that this is my best shot at my best life right here and right now.
Mm-hmm. And what would you like to have happen when you die?
I mean, if to dream about it and there are no limitations to our fantasy, then I would like to be reborn. I would like to have another life because I just learned how to finally enjoy my life, and I don't want those skills to get wasted when I die.
I would just like to make a public service announcement for people listening who are younger than 35. I feel like this is so true, and I'm not going to say it's universal because people grow up quicker and than others and all that, and cultures are different. But I will say, most humans start learning how to enjoy life around 30, 35. It's just like, I think all of us think we're enjoying it all the way up until then, but I totally understand. And so I'm going to pick that apart a little bit more in a second. But first, I would like to ask you, if you did get to come back, would you want to have memories of this life and be able to like build on the foundations and lessons you learned in this one? Or would you prefer to just start anew with no memory of the other life?
I would prefer to start a new life without memory of the previous one, but with the skills from the previous one.
Good
You know
answer.
how some people are like, we're called them old soul.
Mhm.
They're born that way. Since they're babies, they seem like they know this life. They figured it out. They have their opinion on everything, and they're like this 2-year-old children, you know?
Yeah.
So I kind of get this feeling with those people, like, oh my God, I joke about it. I say, like, it seems like it's not your first life, you know? It seems like you know it all.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
great. Okay, so I danced around two subjects that I think are pertinent, and it would be unfaithful of me not to ask them, which is I would like you to explain to my American mostly audience your philosophy on the best case scenario for like what's going on with Ukraine. And so I'm asking this, like, you're not a head of state, and you're not a military official, and you're not a politician. So I'm not asking you to like outline a plan that would bring peace to the region or anything like that. I'm asking you more about like in your heart, how do you feel and what do you wish and hope will happen? Like, and so you don't need to be exact of like, and it would require this and Putin would have to do that. And Zelensky, you know, I'm not asking that kind of a question. I'm just more asking you to like bare your heart, because you mentioned when I was on your podcast that you were stuck during COVID, unable to go home because a war broke out in your country. And my heart just was like breaking when I heard that. So let's start at that point.
Yeah. So, the COVID happened before in 2020. The full-scale invasion happened in 2022. The war is there since 2014 in Donbass. So a lot of people, why politicians call it full-scale invasion? Why wouldn't they say just war? You know, it's so confusing.
Yeah,
but it's because of that. You know, it's because of the war in Ukraine. Russia occupied Ukrainian territory in 2014, Donbass and Crimea, right?
Yeah.
And the military conflict has been ongoing since 2014. And that's why, to distinguish between these two events, they call 2022 event as a full-scale invasion instead of war, because war has been there already for more than 2 years.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when I first discussed the war in Ukraine with my friends, when it first outbroke, the full-scale invasion in 2022, I was all like emotional and obviously over flooded with emotions, because my family was there. My mom, my brother was still there. I'm the first generation U.S. immigrant, right? So I'm the first one who immigrated. And they never intended to. My mom wanted to live her whole life in Ukraine. And just because of this, she woke up and because of missiles at 5:30 a.m., February 22, 2022. So yeah, she had to move and leave her house and her family, her husband even there. So basically, there is no way I'm unbiased in this question, or non-emotional.
Yeah.
And my friends I was complaining to them about the war and the situation, and they were like, yeah, but let's look at it rationally. Let's look at it objectively. Let's look at it without bias. And I'm like, you know what? I cannot do that.
Yeah.
Do not ask me to be somebody I cannot be,
Totally.
So yeah, definitely as a person, as a human, I just want a peace. People are super tired of war, and I guess that was the purpose of this whole long-term game.
Yeah. Well said.
People are super tired, super exhausted. They just want the war to be over. I know that it's not realistic in the nearest future. I know that there will always be ongoing war, whether in active or passive phase, unfortunately, between these two countries. But of course, as a human, I want it to stop, with minimum losses of human life. And I'm not even talking about mental health. That I'm sure that 100% Ukrainians who decided to stay there, and even the ones who moved, like my mom, their mental health is just in a way disturbed, and needs healing.
I think like the most immediate question I want to ask you is like, what does it feel like? Because you're an American and you know Americans and you know us well, like you understand us, I can tell, and you even say like an American. I just want to compliment you as a former ESL teacher. That's always when I know that someone actually learned is when they start using American crutches. I'm like, yep, you're totally in. Congratulations. So my point is, I know you understand us, but I'm going to be blunt. We don't understand you, so it must be awkward. And so I'm curious. I'm sure you can understand why some Americans would be like, why are we bankrupting ourselves to defend a country that's not in NATO? And I'm, again, not going to ask you to be political about this. I'm more just that vibe of like, we can't help everyone. There's also people in Yemen who need our help. There's people here who need our, you know what I mean? Like that argument. But then at the same time, I know that like, the one time in my life where my life was being threatened and I called the police, the feeling of having a police to call and knowing that they were going to try to help me. It wasn't even that they would help me. It was that someone was going to come and try to help was the best feeling ever. So like, I also know that a ton of Americans want to give that feeling to Ukraine specifically. So I'm curious, like how you feel when you hear both of those things. Do they both make sense to you? I know you're biased, but do they make sense?
Yes, of course they make sense. I mean, I don't take things personally anymore, after what I've been through this past 3 years. Meaning, I understand that each person and each nation has their own interest. And even in the U.S., we see with the recent elections and the polarized society, we can see that there are two groups of interests that are in conflict, right? So, and each person has their own interest. Your supervisor has their own interest. Your coworker has their own interest. You have your own interests, and it's nobody's business to stand up for other person's interests or other group of people interests because they're busy thinking about their own interests. I get it. So it does make sense to me from the rational perspective, It's great that the U.S. as a U.S. citizen, it's great that the U.S. has so much power as the number one economy in the world to provide help to other countries on top of just being number one economy in the world. So I think sometimes we just don't know how much resources we have, and we assume there is a scarcity, Yes, I understand government workers, budgets, everything is tight, maybe tight. But I wonder how much U.S. can really afford, helping all these people, all these different things. I think it can. I think it can. Yeah. Just personally. So, yeah, I would just say I do understand both sides.
Yeah.
I understand that Americans who want to help Ukraine, they're driven by this feeling of injustice and unfairness, and I feel that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing is that U.S. is a huge player in this whole geopolitical game, right? And so we have to participate, It's just that the extent of participation, I think that's the question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great answer. I mean, it's so fascinating that it's not your choice that you are Korean. It's not your choice that you're Ukrainian. It is your choice to live in El Salvador. That's very different. But those other two are not a choice. And yet it seems like through whatever luck or bad luck, however you would want to look at it, I would call it just life is interesting. You are from two places that are constantly being attacked and divided and part of a huge geopolitical game. Literally, that word, like you said. Like South Korea is a piece on a chessboard between the USSR, that's now Russia, and the United States and China now. And then Ukraine has always been that piece once, because it's so far to the west. And so I just find it fascinating that like it's almost as if you believe in fate, it's almost as if you were fated to be a person who was going to be dealing with conflict, like on not the personal level, but the larger level, which is so, because I'm sure you have personal conflict. I know you have personal conflict. Everyone does, but it's like, everyone has that. That's like normal to bear, but it's this other thing that, a lot of us like who grew up in America so far, with the small exception of 9/11, we haven't really ever been attacked like here. We don't know that feeling, obviously World War II, there was an attack, and that really does count. And that's why that generation behaved so differently. Do you feel like that was helpful to you? Do you feel like that's made life enriching? Do you feel like it's been a benefit to come from both of those spots?
Both of those spots, you mean?
Like to have the identity crisis of, you care about your people, Koreans, on some level enough that you moved there and wanted to get to know that cultural part of your identity, and then, or ethnicity, however you want to refer to it. And then the fact that because this is what's interesting to me is like, I'm a cross-cultural communication, air quotes, heavy air quotes expert, only because I was an ESL teacher. So it was like, we had to take so many classes on culture and iceberg theory and then ethnicity and how different the two are. And that you can't just look at someone and say, you look Korean, you can't be Ukrainian. Like, that's ridiculous, in my opinion, you are more Ukrainian than you are Korean, because where you grow up is so much more of your identity, in my opinion, again, than what your racial or ethnicity features appear to others and yourself. So I'm curious if you even agree with that, because obviously you can disagree. But then on top of that, I'm curious if you feel like, I don't know, like, do you embrace the fact that you're from these two incredibly topical and geopolitically important places, so to speak?
Yes. So these days, I don't feel identity crisis as much anymore. I think I actually feel, and I think that personal therapy really helped with that.
Cool.
Because I started feeling more connected to myself and to other people as well. And so I think these days I feel more like my identity integrated. Now, it's not something wholesome right now. It's like synthesis, instead of picking things apart, like we do in analysis, we synthesize things together. So the same with my identity. Before I used to have this conflict, oh my God, am I Korean or am I Ukrainian? And then later on American, so I was like constantly like, glasses half full or half empty, am I good enough American, or am I good enough Ukrainian or Korean, but now I feel I see the world differently. I see myself differently. I see the world as glasses half full, and my identity is also like that. I see that I am everything, and it's okay.
That's cool.
Yeah, I have ethnic background as Korean. I look like Korean. I look Asian mostly, even though I do have some European roots, and Bartuli is my last name.
Totally.
That came from my grandpa, who was actually a German immigrant.
Wow.
I don't know why it sounds Italian.
Yeah, it sounds Italian. That's so funny.
Yeah, but he was a German immigrant to the Soviet. So I'm like 25% German, let's just say, by just ethnically. But you can never say it. Tell it by my face, when you see my face. So I do feel, I agree with you. I do feel more Ukrainian mentality. Like I don't feel 100% Ukrainian either these days, because I have lived overseas for so many years now, 14 to be exact.
Wow.
And I've absorbed many, many different cultures by now. So I don't feel 100%, like 100% Jews, like they say. No, I'm not 100% Ukrainian, but I do feel like all these backgrounds, I have it in me, and I think it's actually a good thing in this globalized world these days. It's good to have this many, because it gives me better understanding of multicultural environments, like that intercultural communication between different cultures. It really gives me advantage in this world, in the professional world as well. Because of this globalization.
Yeah. And I'm sure it must be so fun because we live in such an interesting era now where when I was going to go on your podcast, I saw your name. And so Alina to me is actually like a Netherlands Dutch name. I'm just explaining my thought process in my head. And Bartuli is like totally Italian because I'm Italian, and I'm just like, oh, it ends in Li. It's like definitely without like I made those two assumptions that okay, she's European, and then when I went on the call, it was like El Salvador, and I'm like, whoa, okay, I guess maybe Portuguese, and then she went north, like, and then I see you, and I agree, you look like Asian for sure, like there's so then I was just like, my mind, this used to happen to me as an ESL teacher all the time, so it wasn't like the first time I've gone through this, but it was like a gentle, awesome reminder that you can just never know. You can be on a plane. Your plane story from when I was on your podcast is so good, so I'm actually going to ask you to retell it just because it's so funny to me. But before we do that, real quick, do you think El Salvador is like a landing spot and you're going to be there a very long time, or do you see yourself moving again and again and again, or just once? Like what the wanderlust, as we call it, do you have that?
Yes, I actually like it here. I have been here for 5 years, but it's a very peaceful place. I mean, people think it's an unsafe place and don't go there, but it's actually a very peaceful place. For me personally, there's a lot of nature in the city, in the capital. I don't know. I have traveled to maybe, 30, 40 countries by now and lived in 5 countries. So, I can tell you that there are not many capitals in the world that are that peaceful and green. Literally, I can see from my apartment window, I see greenery. I feel like I don't live in the city even. You know, it's just so peaceful, and I like that. So I like it here for that purpose. But at the same time, it might get boring here, you know?
Yeah.
There is some lack of cultural activities, events, especially the international community of expats is not that big. So that kind of affects your lifestyle in a way that it's a little bit boring. And I had fun here for like maybe first 2-3 years, right? And now I'm just like, okay, I'm ready to move on, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm slowly preparing to move.
That makes sense. The second to last question I have, because I do have one last question to ask, is just to relay your story of the first time you flew to South Korea with your classmates, because it was like so funny. And I think it typifies for my audience exactly the pleasure of how ethnicity meets culture meets all of these other talking points.
So I think that what happened when I for the first time as a Ukrainian student, I won this government scholarship, Korean government scholarship to study in Korea. That's how I could afford studying there. And so I was flying in a plane with other students who won the same scholarship, right? There were like 4 other students from Ukraine, and I was the only ethnic Korean among them. So what happened, we were flying Korean Airlines, and the stewardess, she approached us and she was like, oh no. She had all this conflicting emotions. She was like, oh, I need to use my English. No, but I'm so ashamed, to use my English. It's not good enough. And so she was like, she had struggle in her face. And then she saw me, Korean looking lady, and she was like, oh, thank God you're here, kind of thing, right? She had such a relief written on her face, and she was like, and she started speaking to me in Korean, I don't remember. And I was zero. I started learning Korean from scratch in Korea, like literally alphabet. And I was looking at her like blank face. And my friend, back then, just another student from Ukraine, he was actually teaching Korean, and his major was Korean, and he was completely Caucasian-looking, Ukrainian-looking guy, and he started answering her in Korean. So the lady was like, oh my God, her mind was blown up. Like, how come this Korean lady doesn't speak Korean, but this foreigner can speak Korean?
Yeah, yeah.
And I had a lot of those ridiculous stories in Korea as well. I got a lot of comments like, I had a friend from Spain. And whenever we were together and we were meeting some new friends, some Korean friends, they were like, she would say something simple as thank you, like in Korean, which is 감사합니다, that's it. And people would be like, oh my God, your Korean is amazing. How did you learn that? And whenever I speak something, like, they talk to me, I answered something and they heard a slight accent in my like very elaborate sentences, okay? They would say like, what's wrong with your Korean? Yeah, so I felt in a way like that. It was funny.
Yeah,
funny.
no. And it's funny because it's like you get to be a spy if you get successful at a language and you don't look like the language group. And so my last question for you, it's the same question I ask every guest, but it's my favorite one, which is you have my audience at your disposal. What would you like to tell them?
Oh, well, thank you for listening, guys. And I'm really, it's my honor to be on this podcast. It's the first time I'm actually speaking as a guest. I would be happy to connect. I'm a very open person, as you probably picked up from our conversation with Mike. So yeah, I would be happy to connect. My Instagram is alina.bartuli, ALINA.BARTULI.
Awesome. I think that's really cool, and I hope that some of you do connect, and especially if you have questions and like you're just open-minded and you want to know like more about how someone who's actually from Ukraine feels about what's going on there. I mean, I thought that was a total great part of this podcast for me, because I really do care, and I want to care, and I want to understand, and all I can do is listen to real people talk. I can't listen to politicians talk. It doesn't help me. It doesn't provide any love that way. So thank you again, Alina Bartuli. You're awesome. There will be a note to find her on Instagram, and she has a very awesome podcast, and I will be advertising it through my channels for the episode that I'm on, and not to mention the fact that you should just check it out, because as you can tell from this interview, she is awesome. And for everyone listening,
thank you, Mike.
Yeah, of course. It's just, this podcast is the best part of my life right now, is just meeting people and doing these podcasts. So thank you everyone for listening. If you want to support our show, please head over to mikeyop.com. That's MIKEYOPP.com, and sign up for the newsletter that I write, which is not really a newsletter, it's an essay, and it's usually thoughtful, and I try to be humorous and on point. And then obviously it also announces the podcast every week. So thank you again for everyone listening. Thank you again to Alina. And once again, you have been listening to Coffin Talk. My name is Mike Oppenheim, and we will see you soon.